If you look at where science and spirituality are meeting, there is this sense of if we're all one, right? And if we understand that, then we can step into the world of possibilities that we can create anything together rather than coming from a place where a lot of us are coming from, which is a sense of scarcity, that there isn't enough. So that scarcity pushes us into competition and power over, rather than saying, hey, if we all have this gift of being connected, then anything imaginable is possible if we work together to achieve it.
Leadership Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Leadership Story Talks is produced by Narrative, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
Welcome to Leadership Story Talks. I'm Jerome CEO of Narrative.
And I'm Julienne Ryan, and I'm always excited to be back doing another podcast with you, Jerome, and meeting our latest guest.
Yes, likewise. And before we move on to introducing our guest, I want to remind our listeners to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review wherever you find your podcasts, and check out our YouTube channel, because that's where you can also not just hear us, but also see us. And you can go to narrative.com, NARATIV.com/podcast, where you can find all of our previous episodes. And of course, that's where this one will be. So without further ado, today our guest is Lisa Danels. She is the founder and executive director of Human Edge. She is a senior executive, talent and leadership consultant and coach. Lisa's focus is on developing mindful and purpose-driven leaders, unlocking their full leadership potential. She holds a master's degree in organizational development and human resource management from New York University, and a bachelor's degree in interdisciplinary public policy and administration, with a concentration in international relations from the University of New York at Buffalo. She's also a certified coach through IPEC, which is an accredited International Coaching Federation program, and she lives in Basel, Switzerland. Welcome to the show, Lisa. It's so good to have you.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here with you.
Great.
It's an exciting time, and I think also what's going on in the world as well. There's a lot of need for these type of discussions and this type of work.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and thanks for being here. And really, on that note, the first kind of thing that I noted about your book is that the word human is in it, and I'm curious about what led you to write a book that's entitled The Human Advantage.
Yeah, so I think there was a culmination of things, but I think I would say there are four key areas. One was organizations were moving from this very matrixed organization to a networked organization, and information going up and down and across the matrix was not fast enough. So organizations weren't agile enough. And in order to address this, leaders need to show up differently. So if they're not in this command and control, or what we call policing, and they're managing the work, then what is their new role? What is required of them? And there was also, as you look into the later generations, people want more. They want meaning. They want to live their purpose at work. They're not just coming in to collect a paycheck. And there's this rise of what we call humanistic leadership, where it's based on caring, it's based on empathy, and people really want to be able to deal with some of these complex changes that are facing us in our society. People really care about climate change. They care about how do we take care of people? How do we clean the ocean that is full of plastic? So people want solutions to really complex problems that are facing us in this moment in time.
Mm.
And I want to jump in there as you're saying that, because, when we had our pre-chat, we had a sense of what you're doing, but it wasn't until I opened the book that I had a full appreciation of what you've achieved. And this is unpaid, no endorsement, no money was exchanged in this endorsement, but this book should be on your table next to you closely, or bring it around with you, because you break down all those very intense, complicated topics you talked about. Yes. and you give not just an aspirational action, like you should be conscious of, you should work this into your work. You explain some how you can do it, and also give some good guiding questions to lead discussions and the points, going from power to heartfelt things and empathies in a way that was really graceful. So good for you. I'm not big for bullet points ever, but good for you how you leveraged it and really brought it to life, because it's something that somebody could poo-poo and say, oh, that's just soft stuff. But the soft stuff is the core stuff. And you really showed, you gave somebody a good guidebook basically to have. And it's not a one and done.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, Julienne, the introduction was probably the most difficult to write, because it's something you usually would write at the end of the book, but we started with the introduction to frame the book. And I have to say, you know, I was walking the line between where do you bring in the esoteric and the spiritual, you know, because if you look at where science and spirituality are meeting, there is this sense of, if we're all one, right? And if we understand that, then we can step into the world of possibilities, that we can create anything together, rather than coming from a place where a lot of us are coming from, which is a sense of scarcity, that there isn't enough. So that scarcity pushes us into competition and power over, rather than saying, hey, if we all have this gift of being connected, then anything imaginable is possible if we work together to achieve it. And that's a whole different mindset shift.
Yes.
Yeah.
Before I hand it back to Jerome, I'm going to just say, when I read that start to see those section, I was like, ooh, that's courageous and brave. And you're saying it so well. So back to you, Jerome. I'll step back.
Thanks, Jules. Well, so I guess my question, you know, in your bio, we didn't mention this, but you've worked for and with, you know, quite big organizations, Novartis and you know, kind of household names at this point, and had a career for some of those corporations as well. And I'm curious, when you were talking about all these different concepts, and especially this realization that people want meaning, you know, that the human element is so important. How did that realization happen? Was that something that was kind of gradual throughout your career? Did you notice it right away when you started your career, or is it something fairly new?
So it's such a funny thing, because I never really planned my career. And when people look at my CV, they'll say, oh, you have good pedigree. Like I'm a champion dog, but I never really thought about that. It was just, you know, something opened up or an opportunity happened and I found myself there. But to get back to your question, I was very lucky in finding my purpose, because when I was in university, I was in the middle of my junior year and I was studying biology. And I realized that that was not my pathway. And I felt a little bit like a salmon swimming upstream. So I decided in the middle of my junior year to switch my major, which you can imagine my parents' surprise and dismay, because it meant that I wasn't going to finish in 4 years. Right. So that was a little bit of a challenge for my family. But I knew when I looked in my own truth that that was not it. So I switched in the middle of my junior year to much more of public policy, interdisciplinary. And University of Buffalo, there wasn't a lot of handholding. So when I went into the office, I had to do an internship for a semester. And when I went into the office, they gave me this big binder like this. And I just went through the pages, and my intuition, I got to one and I said, that's it. And it was at the training department within the university. And I got there and I just fell in love with it. And I didn't even make the connection, because when I was in high school, I was part of Future Business Leaders of America. And I got to go to 10 days of American management camp, 7 days of leadership development. And I always thought that was like the easy pathway. And I just took the science pathway because that's what I was good in university. So I had to kind of find my way back. So when it came to that sense of purpose, it really resonated with me, that type of work. And I just stayed with it and built on it as I went from company to company. I will tell you, though, is that not companies are all created equal. So when I started my career at American Express, which I feel incredibly, incredibly blessed about, because it is a fabulous company, especially to start your career, and that when I went from other companies, I realized that they didn't have the same values or purpose or meaning or wanted to have leaders really fully develop into themselves. And in my last corporate role, I'll never forget the interview. I was interviewing with David Epstein, who wrote the foreword for the book. And as I sat down in his office, he was standing above the chair. I'll never forget. I even remember what he was wearing. And he said to me, Lisa, I just want you to know, I invest in a lot in leadership development. And I said, I guess then we're going to be best friends soon then. And one of the things that really drew me to Novartis as a company was that they truly believe that you had to know yourself first. So that resonated with me, and it stayed with me in terms of what I was looking for to match my own purpose with a larger organization. Because I think sometimes people think they're mutually exclusive, and they're not.
It's a full body experience is what you really put to everybody here. Yeah. That it's mind, body, and soul, and a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah. And Julienne, to do that work, right, it also requires inner work. It requires us to look at ourselves, and there's some days where it's not pretty, right? And there's some days where you might have a reaction at work that surprises you. It might even surprise your colleague. And then you have to say, whoa, what was that reaction? What am I reacting to? Because if you look at that word react, it's reenacting something from the past versus I had a response to something. So then we really do need to go back and look at why did I have such a strong reaction, and what can I learn from that? I really think I've been using that in my own life as a mirror to continue with on my own self-development, because we're not finished. We'll never be finished. That's not the purpose.
Yeah, we did I'm smiling because we did a whole episode about our reactions, and where the power of the pause, and just kind of reflecting even in the face of anger, and lots of maybe even beliefs that were challenged, and values that were challenged because of what somebody said or did, and to actually resist the temptation of reacting or looking at what that reaction is. And so it's really fascinating to hear that. And I guess the other thing that I'm taking away from this and the book is that imperative to start with yourself, and to look at yourself. And
yes,
I wonder what the role of leadership is in facilitating that in an organization, because not everyone may have the awareness of that, or maybe not even the desire to do that, right? It's quite Julienne, you mentioned the word courageous and brave. It is kind of a courageous thing to be willing, especially in an organizational setting, to sort of look at oneself. And so I'm curious about that. How does the buy-in get created for that, and what's the role of leadership in facilitating that?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things. I think one, to kind of build off your last point, is that if you start with self, you have to come to the conclusion that the relationship with yourself is the most important. And every other relationship you have in your life is a mirror of that relationship. So if you use that as a tenet, then we can see how we're engaging in all different relationships, and how we can use that as a mirror for self-growth. When it comes to organizations, I think there's this, when I speak to leaders, I think a couple things come up right now. I think the one thing that comes up for leaders is it's a lot for leaders. It's not just managing the work anymore. They're asking to be inspirational. They're asking to have emotional agility. They're asking to get the work done, do things beyond what was done last year, and meet the financial targets. So being a leader today, I think, is one of the most challenging elements. And in order for leaders to cultivate that space, they need to be role models for it. So if they want their team to stand up and be empowered, then they themselves need to role model and be vulnerable in front of their team. And that's one of the key elements, because some of the things I hear from leaders is, hey, I've gotten to the point where I'm actually comfortable sharing power. Because if you look back 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it really wasn't required. right? Because the leaders still had a very deep understanding in their discipline. But now the world is so complex. It's so fast moving. It's so volatile that as a leader, you can't know it all anymore. It's impossible. And if a leader tells you that, then you know that they're an old-fashioned leader, right? Because the new leaders, they need to rely on deep expertise that their teams have. And in order for them to do that, they need to be able to share power. So the leaders are saying now, okay, I share power. But then they go, when I do share power and I sit in a room and I ask my people for feedback, silence, crickets. And then they're wondering, what do I do? And it's all really related to this sense of this personal power, that people need to have this sense of personal power where they believe that they have personal agency and they can shape their life. And when they step into that space, then we can really start playing ball. Then we can really start co-creating with each other. Because until we can do that, there's always this sense of these power dynamics that are going on between the leader and the direct reports. Mm-hmm. And you want to get rid of that.
Mm. Yeah.
You reminded me, like, things come to mind during these things of like somebody had suppressed. He was a very charismatic leader of an organization, or at least a division of, and he wanted feedback, but he only wanted to hear good news. Yeah. So everyone had to recast and squelch anything that would have been important for him to know about what wasn't working and what was going to really impact the bottom line. So it was like the emperor had no clothes type of situation. He just didn't want to hear it. And he didn't last, but it was always a model in my head. But I think you're saying such important things of the breadth and depth, and also nowadays where everything's so media and social media, there's a quick cancel culture. So not only you have to have good ideas, you have to get the verbiage right, or have the wherewithal to stand behind what you say and build trust with your group. So and you're doing a lot when you're coaching your people here.
Yeah, and let me come back to something you said earlier, because you mentioned the word courage before. And I think sometimes people fail to realize where the word came from. It comes from Latin, and it actually means an open heart. It comes from cor, which means open heart. So if we want to have courage, we need to step forward and not be afraid of what's going to happen. And we need to be independent of the good opinion of other people. And that's really challenging. I was just on the phone with a client today, and it's a senior leadership group that I'm working with next week in the States. And they said, well, we have a big agenda, but the leaders are not really willing to step up and own it. So then everybody's pointing fingers and no one's taking accountability because people don't want to step forward because they're afraid they're going to get shot down. Mm. And this is, and you'll see when we talk about the courage to be yourself, it's the first part of the book. It's around, what are these leaps of courage? How do we need to step forward to be ourselves? And I'll tell you, it's a long battle, because we have to think about, like, how am I going to, we're always worrying about how we're going to be perceived, rather than saying, how can I, if I do it with compassion and I do it with authenticity, then my message will resonate with the right audience.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sounds we can only get to this idea of shared leadership, which is why the book starts with self first. But I'm curious about that idea of shared leadership, that once we've done this work and we get to this collective leadership, let's call it. And how do you see because of course we come from, as you know, the background of storytelling and leadership as well. And there's so much that you're talking about that, reminds me of experiences that we've had. And, as I said earlier, episodes and topics we talk about, but the idea that storytelling is a vehicle for some of these insights, that once you get these insights about yourself, then maybe there's a story to tell that could empower somebody else to either tell their own or look at their own selves. But so I guess there's a double-headed question here, which is this idea of shared leadership and the role of stories, whether it's individual stories or collective stories, to kind of enable that shared leadership. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we're always in the process of storytelling, whether it's what we say to ourselves internally and what we say to external people. So I can give you a very real example. Is I was working with a CEO and a leadership team, and it was one of the businesses that was really hard hit by COVID. And when I mean hard hit by COVID, I'm talking about like 95% of their business disappeared within a month or two. So they went really into survival mode. And how are we going to save the business? How are we going to save as many jobs as possible? That is a serious, that's, you hold that to your heart because it's so serious in terms of being able to take care of people in the community and also save the company. And once they got through that process and the company is surviving and it's doing well now, right? When I met with them and I interviewed the leaders as part of a high performing team journey, what came up is they were still in that mode. They were still telling themselves the story that they were stuck and that there were limited resources, and the resources were not fully available, but they were still stuck in this mindset that there wasn't enough. And how do they change that when the environment around them changes? So this collective story is about, one is, how do the teams create meaning for themselves, right? What do they do? What is their purpose? Why are they there? That's a place that we always start with teams. And from there, then they can start to shape the story. Because I think the big difference is that when we come from a place of personal agency and then we do it at a collective level, it means that we can dream together. And that dream, we don't even know what the dream is going to be until the pieces start coming out. Because I had to change my thinking on this. Because at first, I had a more limited view of it. Because I was thinking when you get into this co-creation element, that each person brings a piece of the puzzle. But I realized it's much greater than that. Because what happens is if I have an idea and say it sparks Julienne, your idea, right? Then all of a sudden, something new emerges that neither one of us ever thought possible. And then I really had to change, like, this collective piece of us working together and each person sparking each other in terms of coming up with new insights creates a whole new space that we're not used to operating in. If you look at a lot of teams, they operate in what's already been created. They're not so comfortable stepping into this unknown place where I actually think it's quite magical. And if you do step into it, what you can do in an hour is unbelievable. And my team, we do this all the time. And there's this real sense of euphoria when you're done, because you're like, wow, how did that happen?
I know. And I think we're all in the same business of teaching others or showing ourselves in the meantime how to listen in the moment and disrupt our listening, which is the essence. Like, I know we say we teach storytelling and show storytelling, but essentially it's teaching us how to listen and feedback. And the other element of your book, when you talk about creative thought process and shaking things up, is when you mentioned improv, which I've used. And I remember watching improv people in a session a year. And I said, I learned more about organizational psychology that I studied in that session about how they described change management and how to get the words out and how to play off each other. So whatever you can do to shaking things up is great. But I love the fact you're jumping from the left to the right brain and just getting people to.
Oh, yeah. And thank you for saying that, because we start off with this, the first part of the book is integrating head, heart, and gut, right? And let me share a little bit with this, because I think this is I think one of the most profound messages in the book, which is the head is an amazing tool, right? It takes our ideas and our dreams and it brings it into reality, and we can fill all these amazing ideas that other people have written and we can share, and we create this repository inside ourselves, right? That's only part of it though, right? Then if we add the heart, then we have this capacity to feel and to navigate and sense where other people are coming from. And we just can deal with much more complexity than we could in the past. So you hear a lot of people going, I don't really like the political nature of organizations. I don't really like that. I stay away from that. But that's that heart energy, right? Being able to understand other people's needs and the nuances of how we all show up and what's happening within ourselves. And then we add the gut, that intuition, that spark of intuition, and then we can tap in. There's no limitations. And then if each one of us are aligned in that space where we have access to our heart, head, and our gut, we have an incredible capacity within ourselves and within our organizations. We create more capacity than we could possibly ever use to solve the problems that are in front of us.
I love that that combination, you know, head, heart, and gut, because I think a lot of times, you know, head and the heart's very clear, but I think this idea of gut or instinct, you know, it gets maybe mistaken or confused for heart. And so I like that distinction that you're talking about. And it kind of brings me to the next question, which we thought of in advance, which was, and you talked to even at the very top of the introduction, you know, these times that we live in, it's I think the euphemism of the century to say that it's uncertain and volatile. We have no idea what's going to happen next,
No.
and it feels like we've been in that pattern. I mean, maybe for some people it's been a much longer pattern, but at least worldwide, certainly since the first lockdown of the pandemic in 2020, there's been that pattern, and of just like, okay, when is the other shoe going to drop? And then we didn't think this could go any worse, right? So I wonder, in that context, how has what you do evolved? Or I'm not exactly sure when the book was written. I know that it's just come out, but I'm curious about your thinking around this, and what people should be thinking about right now, and how they can be approaching things in a way that feels, dare I say, I don't know if I can say optimistic, but, you know, at least positive, right? If that's what we're looking for. Maybe that's not even what we're looking for, but I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Now, I think there's two things. I think one is we're all sitting on something, what I call our internal compass, which we have this intuition, gut instinct. I think intuition is even better than gut, because I think gut is only one aspect of our true intuition. We have this ability when we can sync our brain, our right and left brain, our intuition really kicks in. And if you haven't had an opportunity to do any of it's called hemisync. I highly recommend it to you and your audience, because your intuition will skyrocket by balancing these two parts of the brain. But I think the first aspect is our intuition. Sometimes we know things more than we're willing to admit. There's an example in the book where there's a race car driver where he's speeding and he sees something is not right. He sees the audience looking in the wrong direction. And this is the intuition that comes from experience, right? All of us have lots of experiences in our life, and we can quickly, our brain is processing, the right side of our brain processes 11 million pieces of information per second. So we're not really fully using our brain. We're relying way too much on the left side of the brain. And I feel like this is why people are really challenged during this time of uncertainty, because they're trying to figure it out with the left side of the brain that processes only about 40 pieces of information per second. So we need to use our whole brain so that when we sit in uncertainty, there's a great Chinese, when you look at the word change in Chinese, it actually means opportunity and it's opportunity and it's danger, right? When you think of the word crisis, right? And we have to see this opportunity, because there were certain businesses during COVID that completely went out, that we went, wow, like these family businesses. And there were others that, look, jumped in, made their business digital, and came out the other side in a much better way. So I do think, in terms of the hope, I think one is we need to start using some of the tools that we have, which is our intuition and our ability. And I think the other thing that's really missing is this sense of community. I think during the lockdown, I think what's really missing is this sense of, we really need to have a dialogue, and there needs to be more human connection. We put our head down, we're talking to everybody on the screen, and we're missing that, what we call that side chat that happened at the coffee machine. And if you look at some of the really good work that came from the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, who wrote a fantastic book, he really talked about there's a loneliness pandemic now. And a third of there was a study that was done, and a third of this international audience was sitting in loneliness. And then we're wondering why mental problems are rising, why there's more suicides, right? And sometimes we have to take the moment to just connect with somebody else. Because when we truly connect with somebody else, even if it's the bus driver you're getting on the bus, and you just acknowledge them and say hi, people will light up. They want to be seen. They want to be valued in society. And when we marginalize people, then you see problems later on.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to make sure that in this time period where there is chaos, we need to create dialogue. We need to use our intuition, and we need to make that connection so people don't feel like they're going through it on their own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I remember seeing that that article on loneliness and thinking how appropriate that is right now. So thanks for bringing that back into the context of this interview, and just the idea of community as well. It's I think that can seem quite daunting, you know, for a lot of people. With community, what do I need to do? You know, but I think what you just said is connect with somebody else. That's what it means, right? It's quite literally, and in person, right? Just go and have that coffee with someone. It can be as simple as that, and not necessarily an easy step to take, but because we're now so used to, you know, being like this. And but yeah, I really hear you on that. It feels like such an important thing to be doing right now.
And you know, one of the things you know, I know so much of your business is around storytelling, and I think we have to get back into this place of storytelling, because stories ignite the imagination, they open the heart, they allow for that connection, because we want to hear other people's stories. We learn through other people's stories. Like, I don't know how you feel, but I know in my career that if I could learn something from somebody else and avoid falling into a pit, I was all for it. Right.
Yeah.
And I think we need to, you know, one of the things I say is, you know, around us, everyone is our teacher and our angels. And we have to be willing to see every person and the value they bring. It might be different than what we have. But if everyone was like me, the world would be a boring place, because then there would be no dynamics. There would be no engagement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I really want to hear what Jules has to say on this, because that word angels is one that you've used as well in other interviews.
Well, it's always a lesson, because we look at situations and say, what is this supposed to teach me in this moment? You know, even if we're conjuring up a negative emotion or a pause. But what I like about what you've been writing is about the pause, is about taking a moment to step aside. It's about small moments. It's not big agenda moments that you have. You know, nobody really learn. And I'm sorry, this might be shocking for everybody out there, but nobody really learns from a PowerPoint. You learn it from the interpersonal interactions. And what you said, like a side-by-side conversation, when you have a small interaction with an executive that you didn't think knew you, or you run into them in the elevator of whatever building you're in, or just happen to have a good chat. So we learn from others. Eavesdropping, when I used to have an office next to my boss, I learned a lot from him or her, because I was learning how they were handling situations, or the FaceTime. But I think it's being patient, and everything is not perfect. And I'm seeing that we've had a culture here, particularly, that we've taught to the test. Perfect answer, get this score. But really, creativity is when it's amorphous, and you have all the bits you're talking about, what goes into creative and what happens in that room when you're asking people to think a little differently. So I think that's why the book is so valuable.
You bring in such a good point, which is, when we grow up, in most of our societies that we grow up, the red pen comes out, right? So then we get into this stage of, I need to look good, right? Rather than, I need to get better. And then it keeps us stuck in what we've already tried, because we're not willing to look like the fool.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
You know, this is great. I don't know if you guys remember, there's a movie called I Bought a Zoo. Do you guys remember that, with Matt Damon in the movie? And there's this one moment that I absolutely love in the movie, where he's talking about how he met his wife. Right. And he's talking to his son, because his son liked this girl and it didn't work out. And he said, if you had 30 seconds of insane, you know, ability just to do something, to have the courage, what would you do? And then he goes back, and that's how he met his wife. And it's such a beautiful, no, it's so beautiful, because it's like, if you just had 30 seconds where you had so much courage, you would do anything. What would you do in that 30 seconds? And we put that out to the audience, right? Like, if you had that courage, what would you do differently in your life right now? How would you show up?
What a great question to sort of meditate on, right? It brings up a lot, because of where we are, who we are, in terms of, and we've mentioned storytelling now. We also, there's a question that we ask of all of our guests. It's always the same, and it takes us into a little bit of the personal story realm. But could you tell us about an experience that has shaped who you are today, still influences and informs your thinking?
Absolutely. So when I was in my 20s, my mid-20s, and working at American Express, I was very fortunate that I got to work with people from around the world. I was in a global area. And one day, one of the colleagues who worked at American Express he was living in the UK at the time, but he was Egyptian, walked in. And as he walked into my sphere, my arena, there was this instant connection on all levels: physical, emotional, spiritual. And I remember we really hit it off. And he comes from Egypt. So, you can hear the Arabic accent that he had. And I'm sitting there and I'm watching him stand at my desk, and he's talking to me and his mouth is moving. And the only thing going through my head is, my mother is going to kill me. Just the only thing I'm thinking about, a nice Jewish girl from New York, and then I'm standing there and there was this instant connection. And then, we started dating, we started seeing each other, we started having conversation. And then he came into New York and we went to a Broadway show, and we were watching the show. And in the middle of the intermission, he turns to me, he puts his hands on my knee, and he says to me, "I know you're running, but it has nothing to do with the religion. What's going on?"
Wow.
That question, that confrontation changed my absolute life, because I had to answer that question. And he was right. He was absolutely right. I was running from relationships, because of trust issues, because of my own childhood challenges. And that changed my life. That started me on a spiritual pathway. It started me on a self-development pathway. And although we never ended up married, we're still incredibly close friends. And even when this whole Israeli, this Israeli-Palestinian war started, he called me up and he said, "How are you feeling? What's happening?" And it was such a wonderful place of being in the heart and just listening to each other. Because we both, it's terrible on both sides. We feel the pain on both sides. So it was this. So you asked what changed my life, and I was really going deep on that one when I saw that question, and I thought that was the biggest change in my life. That just, I wouldn't be here. This book would not have come out if that moment did not happen.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. And it brings it all back to so many things we just talked about and that are in the book, right? The work on yourself first. That's kind of the big message that came out for you, and then this idea that where you just ended, that he gave you a call, and coming back to this idea of community and connect to somebody else, because I know that in this moment many people are feeling very, very lonely and isolated and are really unsure of what should be their next step, and it just takes that one person reaching out. And so what if you were that person reaching out to someone else?
Of course. And I think the beautiful thing, and I'm sure you see this in your own work, is there was a moment that I love that Oprah Winfrey was talking to her guru, her mentor, Milo. What's her last name? She passed away. And Oprah Winfrey had said, my legacy is going to be the women that I've helped in education in Africa. And she said to her, "No, that's not your legacy." And she goes, "What do you mean that's not my legacy? I've spent so much time and energy." She goes, "No, you don't know what your legacy is, because you don't know how many people you've touched. You don't know on your show if you said something that it had an impact, it changed someone's life." So I'm sure you've experienced this as well, where people will come back to you and said, "When you said this, it had this impact." And one of the things we talk about in the book is words matter. And especially during these time frames when we're so polarized, whether it's with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, whether it's the US politics, whether it's the right rising in many countries. We have to find that place, because if we get stuck in this polarization, possibilities go away. We get rid of possibilities. So we need to find the dialogue where we can allow new possibilities to emerge. That's the only way we're going to deal with these conflicts. Because in the end, when you get to the basics, we all want the same thing. We want peace. We want love. We want to be able to have a great livelihood. We want the best for our family. It doesn't really change from country to country.
Yeah.
So we have to create these dialogues instead of getting stuck in our point of view, because that is not going to get us to a new place where we want to go in the world.
Yeah. And what I love about this, the book and this conversation, is that there really is no separation between an individual person leading their life and an individual person leading an organization or a team, right? That's really the big conclusion for me, is because a lot of people do see these things as very, very separate. There's my life and there's my work, and I think here we're talking about concepts that bring all of that together. And I even believe that there's a lot of suffering that occurs because of that separation, or that we kind of consciously make or unconsciously make. So I wonder, I know this is probably a tall order because of all the different concepts we talked about, but we're coming to the end of this interview, unfortunately, because I feel like I would just love to talk all day. But I wonder if there are maybe a few, or two or three pieces of advice or recommendations. You just mentioned dialogue, and we talked about making connections and all of this, but if you were to drill it down for a listener who would like to know, what should I do once I finish listening to this episode?
Absolutely. I think the first one, coming back to it, is this: cultivate the relationship with yourself. It is the most important relationship you will have in your life. And if you're not being honest with yourself, how in the world are you going to be honest with anybody else? So, and as they say, the old adage, the truth sets you free. So I think that is when we talk about cultivating, and for me, that's about emotional mastery, right? And it's also about mental mastery. What is it that you're telling yourself? That's really key. The second one I would say is look for the genius in everybody. Everybody, and I learned this in a difficult way in a role where I had a manager pull me aside and said, "Lisa, you're really smart, but you're not really honoring other people." And the tears were rolling down my face as this manager gave me this feedback. It was actually not my manager; it was a colleague, one of my managers, and it was one of the biggest gifts. Can I tell you? It changed how I operated with people, because he said to me, he goes, "Other people bring other things to the table, and you're not seeing it." So that was a big lesson for me. So find the genius in other people, because they might not be your gifts, and that's good. That's a good thing. So I would say that is the second one, because when we can collectively take all of our gifts together, there's just unlimited possibilities. And I think the third thing is that we are all work in progress, and we're all part of this human experience. And sometimes we don't get it right, and sometimes we hurt people, and it's not intentional. But sometimes we can break trust. But when we do break trust, and sometimes we have to be willing to tell people, because in our personal lives, people will tell us. But in the corporate world, it's very rare that people say, "You broke trust with me." If instead we just give them the cold shoulder, or we move away from them. So we have to be willing to bridge trust and repair trust. And we have to do that by forgiving people, opening our hearts, and engaging in conversation with them. And when we do that, our organizations are going to be different. They're going to be stronger. And it takes courage to do that, because it's so easy just to say, "Oh, forget about it. I'm just going to marginalize that person." But they're missing the gift, because they might have most of the time it's not intentional.
Yeah.
Either they're reacting out of their own fear, or they're getting caught up in their own needs, and they forget about someone else's needs. So we have to give people a little bit more slack, and have the dialogue, because through the dialogue is the relationship will get much deeper. Then we'll have better organizations where people feel a sense of belonging and feel a sense of safety.
Great. Wonderful. I want to, at this point, remind everyone of the name of the book, which is The Human Edge Advantage, Mastering the Art of Being All In. I believe it just came out about a week ago. So you can now,
Did.
So congratulations on that. And obviously there's a website that people can go to.
One is just my name, Lisa Danels. .com, and you can find all the information about the book and myself. You can also go to human-edge.com, and that's our company website, and you can find all the information there, all of our wonderful offerings. And I'm also on Instagram, so it's danels._Lisa, and also on Facebook, you'll find me. So right. All of those places, and there's lots of good videos and content coming out right now, just little reminders that we can take in every day that remind us that life, this is a journey. This is a process.
Well, great. I really appreciate the time here. And, I feel quite inspired by this conversation and the book itself. It's been a privilege to have some time with you to talk about these concepts that are so important at this time. And I'm going to throw it back to our audience. If you've been inspired by this session, you can consider enrolling your team in our training programs at Narrative, where we support sales teams, leadership development, team building, a lot of the different concepts we talked about today, relating those to storytelling and how you can tell a great story. So that's certainly another action you can take after this episode. I want to thank everyone, as always, for your listening. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Jules. Thanks, everyone out there. And again, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. That's what drives the word of mouth. And go to our YouTube channel to check this out. If you want to see what we all look like as well and our gestures. So until next time, and thanks again, everyone.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.